The new nanny froze when she saw her childhood photo in the Millionaire'S office. The rain came down in sheets that November afternoon, drumming against the windows of the cab as it wound its way up the long gravel driveway. Ava Collins pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the sprawling mansion emerge through the mist like something out of a dream, or maybe a ghost story. Lancaster Estate. She'd seen pictures online, of course, but nothing had prepared her for the real thing. 3 stories of gray stone and arched windows, surrounded by acres of golden fields that stretched toward the horizon. A massive red maple tree dominated the front garden, its bare branches reaching toward the steel-colored sky like skeletal fingers. The cab pulled up to the entrance, and Ava fumbled with her wallet, her hands trembling slightly. 23 years old, and this was the biggest job interview of her life. Nanny to the son of Francis Lancaster, the textile magnate whose name appeared in business magazines and society pages across Nashville. "Keep the change," she mumbled, overpaying by at least $5. The driver didn't seem to notice her nervousness, or maybe he was just used to it. Rich people's houses probably had that effect on everyone. The rain soaked through her thin coat in seconds. Ava hurried up the marble steps, her worn shoes squeaking against the pristine white stone. Everything about this place screamed money, old money, the kind that had been around for generations. She smoothed down her simple navy dress, suddenly very aware of the frayed hem, and the fact that it was the nicest thing she owned. The massive oak door swung open before she could knock. A woman in her late 50s stood there, dressed in a crisp gray uniform. Her expression was neutral, professional. "Miss Collins?" "Yes, that's me." Ava tried for a smile. "I'm here to meet with Mr. Lancaster about the nanny position." "Of course, come in." The woman stepped aside, and Ava entered a foyer that could have fit her entire studio apartment 3 times over. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, catching what little light filtered through the windows. The floor was polished marble, reflecting everything like a mirror. "I'm Mrs. Henshaw, the head housekeeper," the woman said, closing the door against the storm. "Mr. Lancaster is expecting you. He's in his study. Follow me, please." They walked through hallways that seemed to go on forever. Oil paintings lined the walls, landscapes, portraits of stern-looking people in old-fashioned clothes, hunting scenes with dogs and horses. Ava caught glimpses of rooms through open doorways. A library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A dining room with a table that could seat 20. A sitting room with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. She'd grown up with nothing. 21 years in the St. Michael's Children's Center, sleeping in a room with 5 other girls, wearing hand-me-downs and donated clothes. No family, no memories of parents, just a vague sense that once, maybe, someone had cared about her. A soft blue blanket she couldn't quite remember, a man's voice singing something she could never recall when she was awake, and the necklace. She touched it now, a nervous habit, a small silver butterfly on a delicate chain. She'd had it for as long as she could remember, the only thing that had come with her to the orphanage. According to the records she'd finally been allowed to see when she turned 18, Mrs. Henshaw stopped in front of an ornate door. "Wait here, please." She knocked twice, then disappeared inside. Ava stood alone in the hallway, her heart pounding. She could hear muffled voices, Mrs. Henshaw's calm tones, a deeper male voice responding. This was it. If she got this job, everything would change. Steady income, a place to live, maybe even a chance to save some money for the first time in her life. The door opened. Mrs. Henshaw beckoned her forward. The study was all dark wood and leather. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, packed with volumes that actually looked read, not just for show. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, and behind it sat Francis Lancaster. He was younger than she'd expected, early 40s maybe, tired eyes, perfectly tailored suit, dark hair just starting to gray at the temples. He stood as she entered, extending his hand across the desk. "Miss Collins, thank you for coming." His handshake was firm but brief, professional. "Please, have a seat." Ava sank into one of the leather chairs facing the desk. It was probably worth more than she'd earned in the past year. "I've reviewed your application," Francis said, sitting back down. "Your references from the Hartley family were very positive. They said you were excellent with their children." "I loved working for them," Ava said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The twins were wonderful. I only left because they moved to Boston, and I Well, I couldn't afford to relocate. Francis nodded. Understandable, my son. Mason is 5 years old. He paused, choosing his words carefully. He's a good boy, smart, creative, but he's been through a lot. My wife passed away 3 years ago, and he's still adjusting. I'm so sorry, Ava said softly. Thank you. Francis's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Old pain, carefully controlled. He needs stability, consistency, someone who can be there for him, not just as hired help, but as someone who genuinely cares. I understand. They talked for another 10 minutes. Hours. Schedule. Expectations. Ava answered his questions as best she could, trying not to seem too eager, too desperate. But she needed this job. Needed it more than she could express. Finally, Francis stood. I'd like you to meet Mason before we make any final decisions. Would you mind waiting here for a moment? Of course not. He left, closing the door behind him. Ava let out a long breath, allowing herself to relax for just a second. It seemed to be going well. She hadn't said anything stupid. Her eyes landed on the photograph. It sat on the corner of Francis's desk in an ornate gold frame, angled just slightly away from where she'd been sitting. Ava stood without thinking, drawn toward it like a magnet. A little girl, maybe 2 years old, smiled up at her from the photo. She wore a white dress with delicate embroidery along the hem, and in her tiny hand, she clutched something small, a necklace. Even in the slightly faded photograph, Ava could make out its shape, a silver butterfly. The girl stood beneath a tree, a red maple tree, its leaves brilliant red against a blue sky. The same tree Ava had seen when she arrived, the same tree that stood in the front garden right now. Ava's hand went to her own necklace, fingers closing around the butterfly pendant. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. The dress. She knew that dress. The tree. The necklace. This was impossible. The door opened behind her. Miss Collins. Francis's voice sounded concerned. Are you all right? Ava turned, and she must have looked as pale as she felt because Francis hurried forward, one hand reaching out as if to steady her. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. She pointed at the photograph with a shaking hand. Who is that? Francis followed her gaze, and his expression crumbled. For a moment, he looked like someone had driven a knife into his chest. When he spoke, his voice was rough with barely controlled emotion. That's my daughter. Her name was Sophie. He paused, swallowing hard. We lost her 21 years ago. The world tilted sideways. Ava gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. 21 years ago, she was 23. The math. How? She managed to ask. A fire. Francis's eyes never left the photograph. Sophie was just 2 years old. My wife Clara tried to save her, but he trailed off, unable to finish. Ava stared at the photograph, at the little girl who smiled from another lifetime, at the dress she somehow recognized, at the necklace that was identical to the one she'd worn every single day since she could remember. At herself. Ava took the job. She didn't know what else to do. Walking away would have meant leaving behind the only lead she'd ever had about who she might be. And besides, she needed the money. So when Francis offered her the position that same afternoon, she accepted with a smile that felt plastic on her face. Mason Lancaster turned out to be everything his father had promised. A quiet kid with serious eyes too old for 5. He'd watched Ava from behind his father's leg during their introduction, clutching a stuffed elephant. But by the end of that first week, he'd warmed up to her completely. Ava, look. He'd run up to her in the garden, holding a perfectly ordinary rock like it was treasure. I found a dragon egg. Wow, she'd said, crouching down to his level. What kind of dragon do you think will hatch? His whole face had lit up. A red one, like the tree. They'd spent an hour that afternoon building a nest for the dragon egg out of leaves and twigs beneath the red maple tree. The same tree from the photograph. Ava had tried not to think about it, tried not to stare at the exact spot where that little girl, Sophie, had stood 21 years ago, but she thought about it constantly. Every night, after putting Mason to bed, she'd lie awake in her small room on the 3rd floor, nice enough, with its own bathroom and a window overlooking the gardens, and replay that moment in Francis's study, the photograph, The dress, the necklace. It couldn't be her. It was impossible. Thousands of people probably had butterfly necklaces. The orphanage record said she'd been found, or dropped off more likely, in March 2003. That was probably around the same time as the fire. But it had to be a coincidence, except the dress. She remembered that dress. Not clearly, not like a real memory, but the way you remember dreams. White fabric, soft against her skin, embroidery that her fingers had traced. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered to herself one night, staring at the ceiling. "You're seeing what you want to see." But was she? Francis was kind to her, in a distant sort of way. He worked long hours, often locked in his study with phone calls and video conferences, but he always made time for Mason. Breakfast together every morning, bedtime stories every night he was home, and sometimes Ava would catch him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Sadness, maybe, or confusion. "You remind me of someone," he said one evening. They were in the living room. Mason had fallen asleep during a movie, curled up between them on the couch. Outside, rain pattered against the windows again. Nashville in November was apparently just one long storm. Ava's heart jumped. Who? But Francis just shook his head, lifting Mason gently. No one, never mind. She wanted to push, wanted to ask about Sophie, about the fire, about everything. But she couldn't. Not yet. She needed this job. Needed to stay here long enough to figure out what was going on. If anything was going on at all. Valerie Lancaster made it clear from day one that Ava wasn't welcome. Francis's younger sister lived in the east wing of the mansion. Had lived there for years, apparently, even before Clara died. She was 38, but looked younger, with the kind of polished elegance that came from money and good genes, always perfectly dressed, perfectly made up, perfectly cold. "So you're the new nanny." Valerie had appeared in the kitchen that first week, looking Ava up and down like she was evaluating livestock. How quaint. Mrs. Henshaw, who'd been showing Ava where the children's snacks were kept, had stiffened. "Miss Collins comes very highly recommended." "I'm sure she does." Valerie's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Just remember your place, dear. Your staff, not family." After that, it only got worse. Valerie had a way of making Ava feel small without saying anything overtly cruel. Little comments about her clothes, her accent, her background. Questions that weren't really questions. "You grew up in an orphanage. How tragic. You must have felt so unwanted. That's a pretty necklace. Costume jewelry, I assume. Mason seems quite attached to you. Let's hope he doesn't get confused about who actually matters in his life." Ava tried to ignore her, tried to stay professional, stay quiet, stay in her lane. But Valerie had a gift for getting under her skin. "Why does Aunt Valerie not like you?" Mason asked one afternoon. They were in his playroom, building an elaborate castle out of blocks. Ava carefully placed a tower. "Some people just don't get along, buddy. It's not a big deal." "She doesn't like anyone," Mason said matter-of-factly. "Except Dad. She really likes Dad." There was something in the way he said it, a childhood observation that adults would have phrased differently. Ava filed it away without quite knowing why it felt important. Francis talked about his wife sometimes, late at night, when he'd come home from work and find Ava reading in the living room. She'd started staying downstairs after Mason went to bed, unable to face the loneliness of her room. "Clara would have liked you," he said one evening, pouring himself a whiskey. He'd offered her one too, but she'd declined. She had a gift for seeing the good in people. "How did you meet?" "College. She was studying art history. I was supposed to be learning how to run the family business." He smiled, but it was sad. "She thought I was arrogant. I thought she was pretentious. We were both right." "Sounds like love at first sight," Ava said, teasing gently. "More like love at first argument." He took a sip of his drink. "We got married young, maybe too young, but we were happy, and then Sophie came along, and everything was perfect, for exactly 2 years." Ava's breath caught. The fire. Francis stared into his glass. "I was traveling. Business trip to New York. Valerie was staying here. She'd moved in a few months earlier. After a bad breakup, she and Clara were supposed to watch Sophie together." He fell silent for a long moment. "Valerie said she'd gone to bed early, wasn't feeling well. Clara put Sophie down around 8. Checked the baby monitor a few times. Everything was fine, and then he swallowed hard. The smoke alarms went off just after midnight. By the time the fire department arrived, the whole nursery was gone. "I'm so sorry," Ava whispered. Clara never forgave herself. She'd been downstairs getting a glass of water when it started, ran up as fast as she could, but the smoke was too thick. Valerie tried to stop her from going in, probably saved her life, but Clara never got over it. 3 years of grief, and then her heart just stopped. The doctor said it was an aneurysm, but I think she just couldn't carry the weight anymore. Ava wanted to ask more, wanted to know if they'd found Sophie's body, if they were sure she'd died, if there was any possibility. But Francis stood abruptly. "I should get some sleep. Thank you for listening." "Of course." After he left, Ava sat alone in the dark living room, turning the butterfly pendant between her fingers. 2 years old. A fire. March 2003. She pulled out her phone and Googled Lancaster Estate Fire 2003 Nashville. The articles came up immediately. Tragedy strikes wealthy Nashville family. Textile heir loses infant daughter in house fire. The details matched what Francis had told her. Faulty wiring in the nursery. Smoke inhalation. A 2-year-old girl presumed dead, though. Her eyes caught on one line. Remains were unable to be recovered due to the severity of the fire. Unable to be recovered, not found, not confirmed, unable to be recovered. Ava's hands were shaking. She put the phone down, then picked it up again, scrolled through article after article, looking for something, anything, and then she found it. A photo from the funeral. Francis in a black suit, looking hollowed out. Valerie beside him, holding his arm, and in the background, barely visible, a small white casket covered in roses. Empty. Ava thought, what if it was empty? She was being crazy. She had to be. People didn't just survive fires and end up in orphanages without anyone knowing. There would have been records, investigations, DNA tests. Except, there hadn't been a body to test. "This is insane," she muttered. But her heart was racing, and she knew she wasn't going to let this go. The next morning, she found Francis in his study before breakfast. "Can I ask you something?" She stood in the doorway, suddenly nervous. He looked up from his laptop. "Of course. The fire, did they ever... were they able to confirm?" Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by pain. "No, the fire was too intense. They found remains, bone fragments, but not enough to..." He trailed off. "We did the funeral anyway." Clara needed closure. "Right, of course." Ava swallowed. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have..." "It's natural to be curious." He stood, walking around the desk. "But yes, Sophie died that night. I've had to accept that, even without a body to bury." He believed it completely. She could see it in his face, hear it in his voice. 21 years of grief built on an assumption. But what if the assumption was wrong? The wooden box was tucked in the back corner of the closet, behind a row of leather-bound ledgers that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Ava hadn't been snooping. Not exactly. Francis had asked her to grab his reading glasses from the study. He'd left them somewhere, couldn't remember where, and she'd been searching the obvious spots: the desk, the windowsill, the bookshelf. Then she'd noticed the closet door slightly ajar. The glasses were on the top shelf, next to a stack of old tax documents. She grabbed them, was turning to leave, when she saw it. Dark walnut wood, brass hinges, about the size of a shoebox, partially hidden, deliberately placed where casual eyes wouldn't wander. She shouldn't look. She knew that. Francis trusted her in his private space, and going through his things was a complete violation of that trust. But her hands were already reaching for it. The box was heavier than expected. She pulled it out carefully. Setting it on the floor, the brass latch clicked open easily. No lock. Inside, the smell of old paper and time hit her immediately. Letters, dozens of them, tied with faded ribbon. The top envelope was addressed to Clara Lancaster in careful cursive. Ava's fingers itched to open it, but that felt like a step too far. Instead, she dug deeper. Birth certificates, Masons, decorated with a tiny footprint. Another one, older, the paper more yellowed. Sophie Elizabeth Lancaster, born March 15, 2001. Ava did the math quickly. Sophie would be 23 now, the same age as Ava. Her hands were shaking as she set the certificate aside. Beneath it, more papers, hospital records, a baby book with a few pages filled out. First smile, first laugh, first tooth. Clara's handwriting, optimistic and loving. The entries stopped at 18 months. And then she found it. A manila envelope, thicker than the others, with St. Michael's Children's Center printed in the corner. The seal had been broken long ago. The flap tucked inside, Ava pulled it open, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. The first page was a letter, dated March 2003. Dear Mr. Lancaster, per your request, we are providing all available information regarding the child admitted to our facility on March 12, 2003, as discussed. The circumstances of her arrival remain unclear. She was found by a maintenance worker in our parking area in the early morning hours, wrapped in a blanket with no identification or accompanying note. Age assessment, approximately 24 months physical condition. Good health, no signs of abuse or neglect distinguishing features. Small birthmark on left shoulder blade personal effects. One silver necklace with butterfly pendant. Despite extensive efforts and cooperation with local authorities, no family members have been located. The child has been placed in our care and will remain here until suitable placement can be arranged. If you have any questions or require additional information, please do not hesitate to contact our office. Sincerely, Director Margaret Hartwell. Ava read it twice, 3 times. The words blurred together. March 12, 2003. The fire had been March 11th, 24 months old. Sophie had been 2. Personal effects. 1 silver necklace with butterfly pendant. Her hand went to her throat, fingers closing around the familiar shape. She'd always assumed it belonged to her mother, whoever that was. Some faceless woman who'd given her up or lost her or died. But what if... She grabbed her phone with trembling hands, pulled up her photos, scrolled back to the picture she'd sneakily taken of the photograph on Francis's desk, zoomed in on the little girl's hand, on the glint of silver barely visible. A butterfly, small, delicate, identical to the one Ava wore. "Oh my God," she whispered. There were more papers in the envelope. Intake forms, medical records, notes from social workers. Ava scanned through them frantically, looking for anything else, any other clue. And then she found it. A photocopy of a photocopy. The image degraded but still visible. A Polaroid taken at intake. Standard procedure, apparently. A little girl with dark curly hair and wide, frightened eyes, clutching a blanket. The photo quality was terrible. The child's face partially obscured, but Ava stared at it anyway. She'd seen this before. Not the photo itself, but she knew that blanket. Soft, blue, with white stars. She could almost feel it between her fingers. Almost smell whatever detergent had been used. The memory was there, just out of reach, like trying to remember a dream after waking. Footsteps in the hallway. Ava's head snapped up. Heavy footsteps. A man's gait. Francis, probably coming to see what was taking her so long. She shoved everything back into the envelope, stuffed it into the box, grabbed the other papers and tried to arrange them how they'd been. The letters, the certificates, everything. Her hands were clumsy with panic. The box went back on the shelf, not quite in the right spot, but close enough. She closed the closet door, grabbed the glasses from where she'd set them, and was halfway to the desk when the study door opened. "Any luck?" Francis asked. Ava held up the glasses, hoping her voice sounded normal. "Found them. Top shelf in the closet." Right, thank you." He took them, studied her face. "Are you feeling okay? You look pale." "I'm fine, just a little tired." She forced a smile. "Long day. You work too hard," Francis said, not unkindly. "Mason's already in bed. Read him 3 stories and he still wanted more, but I finally got him down around 8. He loves you, you know." Francis's expression was soft. "I haven't seen him this happy since Clara died." The words hit harder than they should have. Ava swallowed past the sudden lump in her throat. "He's a great kid." "He is." Francis paused. "I'm glad you're here, Ava. I know Valerie hasn't made things easy, but you've been good for this family, for both of us. If you only knew," Ava thought. "If you had any idea what I might be." "Thank you," she said instead. "That means a lot." After she left the study, Ava went straight to her room and locked the door. She sat on her bed, pulling out her phone again, opening the Notes app. She needed to write this down before she forgot any details. St. Michael's Intake, March 12, 2003. Fire at Lancaster Estate, March 11, 2003. Sophie's age, 2 years old, 24 months. My age according to orphanage, approximately 2 years old. Personal effects, butterfly necklace birthmark. Left shoulder blade. Ava stood, moved to the mirror, and pulled her shirt over her shoulder. There it was, just below her shoulder blade. A small birthmark, slightly darker than the surrounding skin, shaped vaguely like a comma or a teardrop. She'd never thought twice about it. Just something she was born with, unremarkable, barely visible. But now, she grabbed her necklace, held it up to the light. Sterling silver, definitely real. Despite what Valerie had implied, the butterfly's wings were delicately etched, almost impossibly detailed for something so small. On the back, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, were tiny engraved letters. S.E.L. Sophie Elizabeth Lancaster. Jesus, Ava breathed. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. She opened it warily. Stop digging into things that don't concern you. Ava stared at the message, sent from a blocked number. No way to trace who it came from. Her heart rate kicked up again. She typed back, "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, someone who knows what's best for everyone, including you. What are you talking about? No response. The dots didn't even appear this time. Ava waited 5 minutes, then 10, but nothing came through. She screenshot the conversation, saved it to a hidden folder. Then she sat back on her bed, staring at the ceiling, mind racing. Someone knew she was investigating. Someone was watching, and that someone wanted her to stop. The question was, who? And more importantly, why? Valerie was the obvious answer. She'd made her dislike clear, had access to the whole house, could easily have seen Ava in the study or noticed the box had been moved. But why send a threatening text instead of just confronting her directly? That wasn't Valerie's style. She preferred face-to-face intimidation. Mrs. Henshaw, one of the other staff members. That seemed unlikely. They were all polite to Ava, professional. No reason for them to care if she was poking around in old family documents, unless someone had asked them to watch her. Ava stood, moved to the window. The grounds were dark, except for the exterior lights illuminating the garden paths. The red maple tree stood in shadow, its bare branches like dark veins against the night sky. Somewhere in this house were answers. The truth about what happened to Sophie Lancaster. The truth about who Ava really was. And someone desperately wanted to make sure those answers stayed buried. Well, Ava thought, clutching her necklace. Too bad. She'd spent 23 years not knowing where she came from, not knowing who she was, if there was even a chance, even the smallest possibility, that she was Sophie, that she had a father and a brother, and a place she actually belonged. She wasn't going to let some anonymous text message scare her away. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she'd start asking more questions, carefully, quietly, but she'd find the truth, no matter what it took. Outside, a figure moved in the shadows near the tree. Ava pressed closer to the window, trying to see, but whoever it was had already disappeared into the darkness. She was being paranoid. Probably just one of the groundskeepers or security guards making rounds. Probably, but she locked her door anyway before climbing into bed, and she kept her phone within reach all night, checking periodically for new messages that never came. Ava waited 3 days before saying anything. 3 days of second-guessing herself, of lying awake at night running through scenarios. What if she was wrong? What if Francis thought she was crazy? Or worse, some kind of con artist trying to worm her way into his fortune? She'd lose her job, her home, any chance of ever knowing the truth. But what if she was right? That thought kept circling back, relentless. What if she really was Sophie Lancaster? What if she'd spent 23 years believing she was nobody when she was actually somebody's daughter? When she actually belonged somewhere? She couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. On the 4th day, she found Francis in the garden. It was late afternoon. the November sun already sinking toward the horizon. He was sitting on a stone bench near the red maple tree, his jacket discarded beside him, sleeves rolled up despite the cold. A tumbler of whiskey sat on the bench arm, mostly untouched. He looked tired, more than tired, worn down, like a man carrying weight. He couldn't sit down. "Mr. Lancaster," her voice came out smaller than intended. He looked up, managed a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ava, Mason's asking for you. Something about the dragon egg hatching. I'll go to him in a minute, but first, I need to talk to you about something." Something in her tone must have registered because his smile faded. "Is everything all right, if this is about Valerie?" "It's not about Valerie." Ava moved closer, her heart hammering. "It's about Sophie." The name hung in the air between them. Francis went very still. "What about Sophie?" "The photograph in your study. The one I saw on my first day." She pulled her necklace out from beneath her shirt, held it up so it caught the fading light. "She's wearing this. The same necklace." Francis stared at the butterfly pendant. "Lots of people have butterfly necklaces. Not like this one." Ava's hands were shaking, but she forced herself to continue. "Look at the back." She stepped closer, held it out to him. Francis took it carefully, turning it over. His face went pale when he saw the engraving. "CL," he whispered. "Sophie Elizabeth Lancaster." Ava's voice cracked. "I've worn this every day since I can remember. The orphanage said it was the only thing I had when I arrived. March 12th, 2003. Francis looked up sharply. March 12th, the day after the fire. The silence that followed was deafening. Francis stood abruptly, walked a few steps away, ran his hand through his hair. When he turned back, his expression was a mix of hope and denial, desperately fighting each other. No, this is... Sophie died in the fire, the investigators said. They said they couldn't recover remains." Ava interrupted. "Not that they found a body, just that the fire was too intense. But they found bone fragments. Teeth. Did they DNA test them?" Francis opened his mouth, closed it. I don't think so. Clara was so devastated and I was barely functioning. The funeral home handled everything. They said it was her, and we believed them because why wouldn't we?" Ava pulled out her phone, showed him the photo of the St. Michael's intake letter she'd photographed. A little girl, approximately 24 months old, was found in their parking lot on March 12th. No identification, no explanation. The only thing she had was a silver butterfly necklace. Francis took the phone with trembling hands, read the letter once, twice. His face was ashen. Where did you get this?" "From the wooden box in your study closet." "I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't have gone through your things, but I saw Sophie's photograph and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to know." The words tumbled out in a rush. "I look like her, don't I? In the picture. The same eyes, the same..." "Yes." The word came out strangled. "God, yes, you do. I kept thinking you reminded me of someone, but I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just seeing what I wanted to see because I missed her so much. There's more." Ava turned around, pulled her shirt down to expose her left shoulder blade. "The intake form mentioned a birthmark right here." Francis stared at it for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Sophie had the same one. Clara used to call it her angel's kiss." Ava turned back to face him. "I think I'm her. I think I'm your daughter." The words hung there, massive and impossible. Francis sank back down onto the bench like his legs couldn't hold him anymore. He buried his face in his hands. "This can't be real. This can't be..." He looked up, and there were tears in his eyes. "Do you have any idea how many times I've dreamed about this? How many times I've imagined that somehow, some way, Sophie survived, that she was out there somewhere, alive, and I'd find her again?" His voice broke. "And every time I woke up and she was still gone." "I'm not a dream," Ava said softly. "I'm right here. But how is this possible?" Francis stood again, pacing. The fire was contained to the nursery. If someone took Sophie out before it spread, where were they? Why didn't they say anything? Why would they leave a baby in a parking lot? I don't know. But doesn't it make sense? The timing, the necklace, the birthmark, it all fits. Or it's an incredible coincidence. You don't believe that? Francis looked at her for a long moment. No, he finally said. No, I don't. So what do we do? DNA test. The words came out immediately, like he'd already been thinking them. It's the only way to know for sure. There are labs that can have results in a week, maybe 2. Okay, Ava nodded, relief flooding through her. Okay, yes. But Ava, Francis moved closer, his expression serious. If the test comes back negative, if you're not Sophie, then I'm not, and I'll accept that. Can you? Because I need to know you'll be okay either way. I need to know this won't. He gestured helplessly. I can't go through losing her again, even the hope of her. Do you understand? I understand. And she did. The weight of 21 years of grief. The fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to be real. But Mr. Lancaster, Francis, what if I am her? What if your daughter has been alive this whole time? He closed his eyes. Then someone lied to us. Someone took her from that house and let us believe she was dead for 21 years. And I need to know who. A window opened above them. Valerie's voice floated down, sharp and clear. Francis, are you out here? Dinner's almost ready. Both of them looked up. Valerie stood at a second-floor window, backlit so her face was in shadow. But there was something in her posture, the rigid way she held herself, that made Ava's skin prickle. I'll be there in a minute, Francis called back. The window closed with a snap. How much do you think she heard? Ava asked quietly. I don't know, but we should be careful. Francis picked up his jacket, his whiskey. I'll make some calls tomorrow, find a reputable lab. We'll do the test as soon as possible. But until we have results, we don't tell anyone else. Not Valerie, not the staff, no one. What about Mason? Francis's expression softened. Especially not Mason, if you are Sophie. And God, I can barely let myself think it. But if you are, then he has a sister. And if you're not, I don't want him getting attached to that idea just to have it ripped away. He's already attached to me. As his nanny, that's different. Francis paused. Can you keep doing this? Taking care of him? Being around the house? Acting normal while we wait? Can you? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I have no idea, but I'll try. They walked back toward the house together, the sky deepening to purple overhead. As they reached the door, Francis caught her arm gently. Ava, if you are Sophie, if this is real, I need you to know something. He swallowed hard. I never stopped looking for you. Not really. Every dark-haired girl I'd see, every child around the right age I'd wonder. Clara thought I was torturing myself, but I couldn't help it. Some part of me always hoped. Tears stung Ava's eyes. I always wondered who I was, where I came from, if anyone out there was looking for me. I was, Francis said. I am. And if you're her, if you're really my daughter, his voice broke, then you were never unwanted, Ava. Never forgotten. You were loved every single day. Inside. Through the window, Ava could see Valerie moving through the dining room, setting the table with precise, angry movements. Could see Mrs. Henshaw bringing in dishes from the kitchen. Could see Mason run through, probably looking for her. This house. This family. It might be hers. Really hers. Not just a place she worked. Not just people she cared for. Actually, truly hers. Or it might not be. And in 2 weeks, she'd know for certain. 2 weeks had never seemed so long. The 2 weeks felt like 2 years. Ava went through the motions, making Mason breakfast, reading him stories, playing dragon hunters in the garden. But her mind was always somewhere else, in a lab across town, where technicians in white coats were comparing her DNA to Francis's, where the truth was being written in genetic code, undeniable and absolute. Francis was worse. He threw himself into work, spending 14-hour days locked in his study. But Ava would catch him staring at her sometimes, his expression unreadable, like he was trying to memorize her face, like he was already grieving if the answer was no. They'd done the test discreetly. Francis had called in a favor from a colleague who knew a lab director, someone who could be trusted to keep things quiet. Ava had given a cheek swab in Francis's study one morning before dawn, when the rest of the house was still sleeping. Francis had done the same. Then they'd waited. Valerie noticed something was off. Of course she did. "You've been distracted lately," she said to Ava one afternoon. They were in the kitchen, Ava making Mason a snack, Valerie pouring herself wine despite it being barely 3 o'clock. "Everything all right?" "Fine," Ava said, not looking up from the apple she was slicing. "Just tired." Valerie took a long sip, studying her over the rim of the glass. "Francis seems distracted too, almost like you're both keeping a secret." Ava's hand slipped. The knife nicked her finger. "I'm not keeping any secrets." "Of course not." Valerie's smile was razor sharp. Why would the hired help have secrets? She left before Ava could respond, heels clicking against the marble floor. Ava wrapped her bleeding finger in a paper towel and tried to stop her hands from shaking. 10 days in, Francis got the call. Ava was upstairs with Mason, helping him build an elaborate Lego castle, when Mrs. Henshaw appeared in the doorway. "Miss Collins, Mr. Lancaster would like to see you in his study." Ava's heart stopped. "Now. He said it's important." Mason looked up from his Legos. "But we're not done with the tower. I'll be back in a few minutes, buddy. You keep building, okay?" She walked downstairs on legs that felt like water. The hallway to Francis's study stretched endlessly. Each step felt heavier than the last. The study door was closed. Ava knocked once, softly. "Come in." Francis stood by the window, his back to the door. His shoulders were rigid, hands clasped behind him. An envelope sat on his desk. Plain white, unremarkable, except for the lab's logo in the corner. "Close the door," Francis said without turning around. Ava did. The click of the latch sounded impossibly loud. The results came back. His voice was carefully controlled, giving nothing away. "This morning." And Ava could barely breathe. Francis turned around. His eyes were red, like he'd been crying, or trying not to cry. When he spoke, his voice cracked on the first word. "You're her." He took a shaky breath. "Ava, you're Sophie. You're my daughter." The room tilted. Ava grabbed the back of a chair to keep from falling. "Are you sure? Are they absolutely sure?" 99.9% certainty? Francis moved toward her, hands outstretched like he wanted to touch her, but wasn't sure if he was allowed. "The match is conclusive. You're Sophie Elizabeth Lancaster. You're my little girl." A sound escaped Ava's throat. Half laugh, half sob. "I have a father. I actually have a father. And I have my daughter back." Francis's face crumpled. "Oh God, Sophie." She didn't remember moving, but suddenly she was in his arms and he was holding her like she might disappear if he let go. 21 years of grief poured out of him in shaking sobs. Ava held on just as tightly, tears streaming down her own face. "I looked for you," Francis kept saying. "Every day I looked. I never gave up hoping. I'm here." "Ava," Sophie whispered. "I'm right here. I'm home." They stood like that for a long time. Two people who'd been lost finally finding each other. Outside, the world kept turning. Somewhere in the house, life continued as normal. But in that study, everything had changed. Finally, Francis pulled back, wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Don't apologize." Sophie's face was wet with tears, too. "Please don't apologize." He laughed shakily. 21 years of questions. Where do we even start? "I don't know." Sophie looked down at her hands. Hands that were hers, but also Sophie Lancaster's. Hands that belonged to someone with a family, a history, a name. "This is real. This is actually happening." "It's real." Francis picked up the envelope, held it out to her. "You can read it yourself if you want." She took it with trembling fingers, scanned the technical language and numbers that confirmed what her heart had already known. Match probability, 99.9%. Conclusion, Subject A and Subject B share a biological parent-child relationship. "What do we do now?" she asked. Francis ran a hand through his hair. "I need to tell Mason. He deserves to know he has a sister, and we'll need to change your legal name." "Transfer your inheritance? God, there's so much." "Wait," Sophie set the envelope down. "Before we do anything else, we need to figure out what happened, how I ended up at St. Michael's, who took me from the fire." Francis's expression darkened. "I've been thinking about that constantly. Someone was in this house that night. Someone took you from your crib. drove you to that orphanage and left you there. Then they came back and let everyone believe you'd died. Valerie was here." The words hung heavy between them. "She said she'd gone to bed early," Francis said slowly. "She didn't come downstairs until after the fire started, but she could be lying. Why would she do that? What possible reason?" He stopped, shook his head. "No, Valerie has her issues, but she wouldn't. She's my sister. Someone did it. Francis, someone was here that night who had access to the nursery, who knew the house well enough to get in and out without being seen. We don't know that it was someone from the house. It could have been." Francis grasped for alternatives. "A kidnapping attempt gone wrong. Someone who broke in, took you, then panicked and left you at the orphanage. The fire started in the nursery, right where I should have been sleeping." Sophie met his eyes. "That's not a coincidence." Francis sank into his desk chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe the fire was supposed to cover up the fact that I was gone. Make everyone think I died so no one would look for me. That's..." He stopped, unable to finish, because it made horrible, perfect sense. "We need to talk to Valerie," Sophie said. "And say what? Did you kidnap my daughter and fake her death? She'll think we've lost our minds. We don't tell her about the DNA test yet. We just ask questions. About that night. About what she remembers." Francis looked at her for a long moment. "You've only been my daughter again for 10 minutes, and you're already making me face things I don't want to face. I've spent 21 years not knowing who I was. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life not knowing why." A knock at the door made them both jump. "Mr. Lancaster?" Mrs. Henshaw's voice. "Miss Valerie is asking about dinner plans." Francis and Sophie exchanged a look. "Tell her we'll all eat together tonight," Francis called back. "Family dinner? 7 o'clock. "Very good, sir." Footsteps retreated down the hall. "Family dinner," Sophie repeated. "Are you sure that's a good idea? If Valerie knows something, maybe we can draw it out of her. People get comfortable over meals, say things they wouldn't normally say, or she'll realize something's up." "Maybe." Francis stood, moved to stand beside her. "But I'm done living with questions. My daughter is alive, and someone stole 21 years from both of us. I'm going to find out who." Sophie touched her necklace, Sophie's necklace, and felt the weight of her real name settling onto her shoulders. She wasn't Ava Collins anymore. She was Sophie Elizabeth Lancaster, and she was going to find out the truth, even if that truth destroyed what was left of this family. Through the window, she could see Mason playing in the garden, attacking invisible monsters with a stick sword. Her little brother. She had a little brother. The thought made her smile even as dread coiled in her stomach, because tonight at dinner, they'd start asking questions, and depending on the answers, everything could change. Again, dinner was served at exactly 7 o'clock. The dining room had been set with the good china, delicate porcelain with gold trim that probably cost more than Sophie had earned in her entire life as Ava Collins. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier overhead, throwing prismatic patterns across the walls. Mrs. Henshaw had outdone herself with the meal. Herb-crusted lamb, roasted vegetables, homemade rolls that filled the room with the smell of butter and warmth. It should have been nice. A family dinner. Instead, it felt like sitting on a powder keg. Sophie took her usual seat, the one she'd occupied as the nanny, not quite family but not quite staff either. Francis sat at the head of the table, Mason to his right. Valerie swept in last, fashionably late as always, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than Sophie's entire wardrobe. "Well, this is formal," Valerie said, taking her seat across from Sophie. "What's the occasion? Do we need an occasion to have dinner together?" Francis poured wine into Valerie's glass, then his own. He'd offered Sophie some, but she'd declined. She needed to stay sharp. "We haven't had a family dinner in months." Valerie's eyes flicked to Sophie. "Oh, I see. The help has been promoted to dining companion now." "Ava is more than help," Francis said quietly. "She's part of this household." Something flickered across Valerie's face. Surprise? Maybe. Or calculation. "How progressive of you, brother." Mason, oblivious to the tension, was building a castle out of his roll pieces. "Ava says dragons used to live in castles. Real ones. Not pretend." "Did she now?" Valerie sipped her wine. "What other stories has Ava been telling you?" "All kinds. Mason said happily. She knows everything. Everything. Valerie's smile didn't reach her eyes. That's quite a claim. Sophie cut into her lamb, trying to ignore the way her hands wanted to shake. Francis had said to let him lead, to follow his cues. But sitting here under Valerie's scrutiny felt like being dissected. Valerie, Francis said after a few minutes of awkward silence, I've been thinking about the fire, the one that... He paused, his jaw tightening. The one that took Sophie. Valerie's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Why on earth would you bring that up now? At dinner. I've been having trouble sleeping. Memories, I guess. Francis's voice was carefully neutral. I realized I never really asked you about that night. What you remember. Francis, humor me. Valerie set down her fork with a sharp clink. What do you want to know? I've told you everything 100 times. Tell me again. The silence stretched. Sophie could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the soft clink of Mason's fork against his plate. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Fine. Valerie took a long drink of wine. I'd gone to bed early, had a migraine, took some medication and was out by 9. The smoke alarm woke me just after midnight. By the time I got downstairs, Clara was already trying to get to the nursery, but the smoke was too thick. I pulled her back before her voice caught, before she could get herself killed too. You didn't see anyone else? Anyone in the house who shouldn't have been there? No, just Clara and me. And you know the investigators checked everything. Faulty wiring in the nursery, a tragic accident. But they never found... Francis stopped, swallowed. They never conclusively identified remains. Valerie went very still. What are you getting at, Francis? Just trying to understand, 21 years later, and I still have questions. Well, I can't answer them. Valerie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood. I need more wine. She walked to the sideboard, her back to the table. Sophie watched her pour with shaking hands, watched her grip the bottle too tightly. Aunt Valerie, Mason's small voice cut through the tension. Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. But her voice was too high, too tight. Francis exchanged a glance with Sophie. She gave a tiny nod. They both saw it, the cracks forming. Valerie, Francis said, gentler now. If there's something you're not telling me. There's nothing. She turned around, and her face was a mask. Can we please change the subject? This is hardly appropriate dinner conversation, especially in front of Mason. You're right. Francis backed off. But Sophie could see the wheels turning in his mind. I'm sorry. Let's talk about something else. The rest of dinner passed in stilted conversation. Valerie drank 3 more glasses of wine. Francis barely touched his food. Mason chatted about school and dragons and the fort he wanted to build in the backyard. The only person at the table not drowning in tension. Finally, blessedly, Mrs. Henshaw appeared to clear the plates. Mason, Francis said, why don't you go upstairs and get ready for bed? I'll be up to read you a story in a few minutes. Can Ava come too? Not tonight. Buddy, just me tonight. Mason pouted but obeyed, trudging upstairs with the resigned air of a 5-year-old who knew when arguing was pointless. The moment he was gone, Valerie stood again. I'm going to my room. Sit down, Valerie. Something in Francis's tone made her freeze. Excuse me. Sit down. He wasn't asking anymore. Valerie sat slowly, her eyes narrowing. What is this? Some kind of intervention. You could call it that. Francis pulled the DNA test results from his jacket pocket, slid them across the table. Read it. Valerie stared at the envelope like it was a snake. What is this? Open it. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the papers. Sophie watched her face as she read, watched confusion turn to shock, turned to something that looked like terror. This is... Valerie looked up at Sophie, then at Francis. This is impossible. 99.9% certainty, Francis said. Ava Collins is Sophie Lancaster, my daughter. The daughter you told me died 21 years ago. She did die. You saw what? Sophie found her voice, heard it come out steady and cold. What did you see, Valerie? The fire. The nursery was empty, Francis finished. The nursery was empty, wasn't it? Because someone had already taken Sophie out. Valerie's face drained of color. You're insane, both of you. The timeline matches, Sophie continued. I was found at St. Michael's the morning after the fire, a 2-year-old girl with no identification, wearing this. She held up her butterfly necklace. The same necklace Sophie Lancaster was wearing in every photograph. Lots of people have, with SEL engraved on the back. Sophie's voice rose. How many people have that, Valerie? Valerie stood so abruptly, her chair fell backward with a crash. This is ridiculous. I'm not listening to this. You're not leaving this room until you tell us the truth. Francis's voice was like steel. What happened that night? What did you do? I didn't... Valerie's breath was coming in gasps. I didn't mean what? The words hung in the air. Valerie's face crumpled, and suddenly she looked 20 years older. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. Sophie's heart stopped. Oh God. Francis's face went white. Valerie, what did you do? Valerie's hands were shaking. You have to understand. After Clara had Sophie, you didn't need me anymore. You had your perfect little family. And I was just in the way. An old maid living off her brother's charity. So you took my daughter. Francis's voice was incredulous, horrified. I panicked. Valerie's eyes were wild now, tears streaming down her face. I'd been drinking. I went to the nursery too. I don't know what I was thinking. To hold her, maybe. To remind myself what it felt like to matter to someone. But she kept crying, wouldn't stop crying. And I thought... She stopped, gulping air. You thought what? Sophie's voice was barely audible. I thought maybe if she was gone, if you lost her, you'd need me again. You'd lean on me like you used to before Clara, before everything changed. Valerie was sobbing now. So I took her, drove to that orphanage and left her in the parking lot. Then I came back and started the fire, Francis finished, his voice hollow. Just a small one, in the nursery, to make it look like an accident, like she'd... Valerie couldn't finish. Like she'd died, Sophie said. 21 years. 21 years of her life, stolen because this woman wanted attention. I never meant. I thought you'd move on. I thought we'd grieve together, and then things would go back to how they were. But Clara, she never got over it. She blamed herself, and you... Valerie looked at Francis with desperate, pleading eyes. You pulled away from everyone, including me. It didn't work. Nothing worked. And then Clara died, and I realized what I'd done, what I'd taken from all of us. But I couldn't. I couldn't take it back. The silence that followed was absolute. Francis stood slowly. His face was a mask of fury and grief, and something that looked like betrayal so deep it had no bottom. Get out. Francis, please. Get out of my house. His voice was quiet, deadly. You have 1 hour to pack your things, then I'm calling the police. You can't. I'm your sister. You're not my sister. Francis's eyes were cold. My sister wouldn't have stolen my daughter. Wouldn't have let me believe she was dead for 21 years. Wouldn't have destroyed my wife's life over jealousy. Valerie looked at Sophie one last time, her expression a mix of regret and desperation. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sophie stared back, feeling nothing. No anger, no forgiveness, just emptiness. 1 hour, Francis repeated. Or I call them now. Valerie fled. The police arrived 43 minutes later. Sophie watched from the upstairs window as 2 squad cars pulled up the driveway. Lights flashing but sirens silent. Francis had made the call from his study, his voice steady and clinical as he reported kidnapping, arson, fraud, 21 years of crimes laid out in careful detail. Valerie was still in her room, packing. Sophie could hear drawers slamming, things being thrown, the sound of a woman's world collapsing. She should feel something. Anger, vindication, satisfaction. But all she felt was numb. Ava. Mason's voice came from behind her. He stood in his doorway wearing dinosaur pajamas, clutching his stuffed elephant. Why are the police here? Sophie turned, forcing a smile. It's grown-up stuff, buddy. Nothing for you to worry about. Is Aunt Valerie in trouble? Smart kid. Too smart. Yeah, Sophie said softly. She is. Because of the bad thing she did. Sophie's breath caught. What bad thing? Mason shrugged. scuffing his foot against the carpet. "I don't know, but sometimes I hear Dad talking on the phone about bad things from a long time ago, and Aunt Valerie always looks scared when he does. Children see everything. Remember everything." Sophie crouched down to his level. "Mason, do you trust me?" He nodded seriously. "Then trust me when I say everything's going to be okay. Your dad is handling it, and soon things will be better. I promise." "Will Aunt Valerie come back?" "No. Buddy, she won't." "Good." Mason's face was matter of fact. "She was mean to you. I didn't like it." Before Sophie could respond, raised voices echoed from downstairs. She stood quickly. "Go back to your room, okay? I'll come read you another story in a few minutes." Mason hesitated, then obeyed. Sophie headed for the stairs. The scene in the foyer was chaos contained. 2 officers stood with Francis, taking notes while he spoke in that same clinical tone. Mrs. Henshaw hovered nearby, wringing her hands. And Valerie stood at the base of the grand staircase with a suitcase, her face blotchy from crying, her perfect composure completely shattered. "You can't do this," she was saying. "Francis, please, I'm your sister. You kidnapped my daughter." Francis's voice could have frozen fire. "You started a fire to cover it up. You let my wife torture herself for years, blame herself for something you did. You destroyed this family. I made a mistake. 21 years ago, I made one terrible mistake. And then you spent 21 years covering it up." One of the officers, a woman with sharp eyes and graying hair, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Martinez. I need you to come with us. I want a lawyer." "That's your right, but you need to come to the station now." Valerie's eyes swept the room, landing on Sophie at the top of the stairs. For a moment, their gazes locked. Valerie's expression was a twisted mix of regret, anger, and something that might have been pleading. Sophie looked away first. "This isn't over," Valerie said, but her voice shook. "Francis, when you calm down, when you think about this rationally, I will never forgive you." Francis's words were final. "Never. Take her." Detective Martinez guided Valerie toward the door, reading her rights in a steady monotone. The other officer followed with the suitcase. As they led her out into the cold November night, Valerie looked back one more time. "I loved you," she called to Francis. "Everything I did was because I loved you." The door closed. The flashing lights disappeared down the driveway. And just like that, Valerie Lancaster was gone. Francis stood frozen in the foyer, staring at the closed door. His shoulders began to shake. Sophie descended the stairs slowly, carefully. "Francis." He turned, and the mask he'd been wearing cracked completely. Tears streamed down his face. "She was my sister," he choked out. "My baby sister. I was supposed to protect her. And instead He couldn't finish. Sophie didn't think. She just moved forward and wrapped her arms around him. Francis collapsed against her, 21 years of grief and betrayal pouring out in wrenching sobs. "It's not your fault," Sophie whispered. "None of this is your fault. I let her live here. I trusted her with my family. If I'd paid more attention, if I'd seen, you couldn't have known. No one could." They stood like that for a long time. Mrs. Henshaw quietly excused herself, giving them privacy. The house settled into silence around them. Finally, Francis pulled back, wiping his eyes roughly. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't—" "Stop apologizing," Sophie said. "You're allowed to feel this." He laughed, but it was bitter. 21 years. She sat at my dinner table for 21 years, knowing what she'd done. How do you do that? How do you look someone in the eye every day knowing you destroyed their life? Guilt, maybe, or denial. Sophie shook her head. "I don't know. I don't think I'll ever understand it." Francis moved to the window, looking out at where the police cars had been. "They'll charge her with kidnapping, arson, fraud. The DA said she could face 15 to 20 years, maybe more." "Good. Is it?" Francis turned back. "She's sick, Sophie. Mentally ill. What she did was evil," Sophie finished. "Mental illness doesn't excuse what she did to us. To me. To Clara." Francis flinched at his late wife's name. Clara would still be alive if not for Valerie. She carried that guilt for 3 years. It killed her. The weight of that settled over them both. "I need to tell Mason," Francis said quietly. "About you. About who you really are. Are you sure? He's so young. Old enough to deserve the truth. Francis managed a weak smile. Besides, he already loves you. Now he gets to know you're his sister. Half-sister, Sophie corrected automatically. Sister, Francis said firmly. No halves in this family, not anymore. They told Mason the next morning over breakfast. He'd been quiet, picking at his pancakes, clearly unsettled by the previous night's drama. Francis had sent the staff home. They'd heard too much already, and the gossip would spread soon enough. For now, it was just the three of them in the massive dining room. Mason, Francis began, we need to talk to you about something important. Mason looked up, syrup on his chin. Is Aunt Valerie coming back? No. She did something very bad, and she's going to be punished for it. Okay. Mason seemed to accept this easily. 5-year-old logic. What did you want to talk about? Francis glanced at Sophie. She nodded. Do you remember the story I told you about Sophie? My daughter who died a long time ago. Before I was born, Mason said. In the fire. Yes, well, Francis's voice caught. She didn't die in the fire. Aunt Valerie took her away and left her at an orphanage. We thought she was dead, but she wasn't. Mason frowned, trying to understand. Where is she now? Right here. Francis smiled through tears. Mason, Ava is Sophie. She's your sister. The silence stretched. Mason looked at Sophie, then at his father, then back at Sophie. His small face was scrunched in concentration. Ava is my sister. Yes, my real sister. Not just someone who takes care of me. Your real sister. Mason's eyes went wide. Then, without warning, he launched himself out of his chair and wrapped his arms around Sophie's waist. I always wanted a sister. Dad said I couldn't have one because Mom was gone. But now I do. Sophie felt tears spill over as she held him. Yeah, buddy. Now you do. Does this mean you'll stay forever? Sisters stay forever, right? Right, Sophie managed. I'm not going anywhere. Good. Mason pulled back, beaming. Can I tell Dylan at school? He's always bragging about his big brother, but I have a big sister now. Francis laughed. Actually laughed. Sure, you can tell Dylan. This is the best day ever, Mason declared. Then, with the attention span of a 5-year-old, can I have more pancakes? As Francis piled more food on Mason's plate, Sophie felt something shift inside her. The numbness from last night was fading, replaced by something warmer, something that felt like hope. She had a family, a real family, a father who loved her, a brother who thought she was the best thing ever, a home. Outside, the sky was overcast, threatening more rain. But inside Lancaster Estate, for the first time in 21 years, there was light. The story wasn't over. There would be trials, legal proceedings, media attention. Valerie would fight the charges, and it would get ugly. The truth would come out, and Nashville's high society would have a field day with the scandal. But right now, in this moment, Sophie was home, and that was enough. The media found out 3 days later. Lancaster heiress found alive after 21 years, screamed the headline in the Nashville Tribune. By noon, news vans lined the driveway. Reporters shouted questions at anyone entering or leaving the estate. Helicopters circled overhead, trying to get aerial shots of the property. Francis hired security immediately. 2 guards at the gate, 2 more patrolling the grounds. They installed privacy screens along the fence line and issued a statement through the family lawyer. The Lancaster family requests privacy during this difficult time. There will be no interviews or comments at this juncture. It didn't stop the circus. Sophie watched from her bedroom window. Not Ava's room anymore, but the room that had been meant for her. The nursery had been converted years ago, but down the hall was a suite that Clara had decorated for when Sophie was older. Soft blues and whites. A 4-poster bed, built-in bookshelves waiting to be filled. Your mother picked out everything, Francis had said when he showed it to her. She used to come in here sometimes after we lost you. Just sit and imagine what you'd be like, what books you'd read, what posters you'd put up. His voice had broken. She never stopped being your mother. Now Sophie sat on that bed, her bed, scrolling through news articles on her phone. The story had everything: wealth, tragedy, family betrayal, A miracle reunion? Social media was exploding with theories, opinions, hot takes from people who'd never met any of them. That poor girl stolen from her own family. Can you imagine finding out you're an heiress? The aunt is evil. Lock her up forever. Something's fishy about this. Probably a scam. That last one made Sophie's stomach turn. Francis's lawyer had assured them the DNA evidence was ironclad. But still, people would doubt. People always doubted. A knock at the door. "Sophie, can I come in?" Still strange, hearing her real name. "Yeah." Francis entered carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Thought you might need this, Mrs. Henshaw made it the way Mason likes. Extra marshmallows." Sophie accepted the mug gratefully. "Thanks." Francis sat in the armchair by the window, looking exhausted. He hadn't been sleeping. She could see it in the dark circles under his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged. The lawyer called. Valerie's arraignment is next week. She's being charged with kidnapping, arson, child endangerment, and fraud. Will you go? I have to. They'll need my testimony. He sipped his chocolate. You don't have to be there if you don't want to. I want to. The words surprised her, but they were true. I want to look her in the eye and know that she can't hurt us anymore. She can't. I promise you that. Francis's voice was fierce. I won't let her. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Outside, a reporter tried scaling the fence before security chased him off. There's something else we need to talk about, Francis said. Your name, legally, you're still Ava Collins. We need to petition the court to change it back to Sophie Lancaster. How long does that take? A few weeks? Maybe a month? It's mostly paperwork. Birth certificate amendment, social security, all the legal documentation. But Sophie, he leaned forward. Once we do this, there's no going back. Your life as Ava Collins will effectively end. Are you ready for that? Was she? Ava Collins had been poor, anonymous, free to move through the world unnoticed. Sophie Lancaster would be wealthy, famous, constantly scrutinized. Every decision would be public. Every mistake would be news. But Ava Collins had also been alone. Sophie Lancaster had a family. I'm ready, she said. Francis smiled, relief evident. Good, because I've also been working with the estate lawyers on your inheritance. The trust fund Clara and I set up when you were born. It's been growing for 21 years, with interest and investments. It's worth about $8 million. Sophie nearly dropped her mug. $8 million. That's yours. No strings, no conditions. It's your money, set aside for you before... He stopped, collected himself. Before Valerie took you. Clara insisted on it. She wanted you to be independent, to never have to rely on anyone. $8 million. Sophie couldn't even conceive of that amount. She'd worked minimum wage jobs, counted pennies, stressed over every bill, and the whole time, there'd been millions of dollars sitting in an account with her name on it. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. It's yours. Though, Francis hesitated, I'd like to help you manage it, at least at first. Sudden wealth can be overwhelming, and there are people who'll try to take advantage. Financial advisors, investment managers, friends who suddenly appear. You need to be careful. Will you teach me how to handle it? Of course. That's what fathers do. He said it simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe this, sitting together, drinking hot chocolate, planning for the future, was what normal families did. There's also the foundation, Francis continued. Clara started it after we thought we lost you, the Sophie Lancaster Foundation for Children. It provides scholarships, supports foster programs, funds child welfare organizations. Clara poured her grief into helping other children. Since she couldn't help you, tears stung Sophie's eyes. She did that for me, for you, and because of you. The foundation has helped thousands of kids over the years, given them opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Francis's voice was thick with emotion. I'd like you to be involved if you're interested, maybe even take over running it someday, but no pressure. It's your choice. I want to, Sophie said immediately. I grew up in the system. I know what those kids go through, if I can help them. She wiped her eyes. Yeah, I definitely want to be involved. Then we'll set up a meeting with the board. They'll be thrilled to meet you. Over the next few weeks, Sophie's life transformed completely. The legal name change went through. Ava Collins ceased to exist on paper, replaced by Sophie Elizabeth Lancaster. She got a new driver's license, new credit cards, new everything. Each document felt surreal, proof that she wasn't who she'd thought she was for 23 years. She met with financial advisors who explained trusts and portfolios and investment strategies in terms she barely understood. Francis sat beside her through every meeting, translating, protecting her from anyone who seemed more interested in their commission than her welfare. She visited St. Michael's Children's Center with Francis and Mason, the director, not the same one from when Sophie had been there, but someone who'd worked there for 15 years, gave them a tour. Sophie saw the room where she'd slept as a child, saw children who looked like she'd once looked, lost, uncertain, hoping. "We'd like to make a donation," Francis said. $1 million. In Sophie's name. The director nearly fainted. "And we'd like to fund a program," Sophie added, the idea forming as she spoke, "for kids aging out of the system, job training, college scholarships, housing assistance. Nobody should have to face the world alone at 18. "We'll call it Clara's Promise," Francis said softly. Sophie squeezed his hand. They also visited Clara's grave, a simple headstone in a peaceful cemetery outside the city. Clara Ann Lancaster, beloved wife and mother. The dates bookended a life cut too short. Sophie knelt and placed flowers, white roses, Clara's favorite, according to Francis. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come home. I'm sorry for everything you went through, but I'm here now, and I promise I'll make you proud." Francis stood behind her, hand on her shoulder, crying silently. That night, Sophie found a box in the study, Clara's journals, which Francis had kept but never been able to read. He gave them to Sophie with shaking hands. "I think she'd want you to have these, to know her through her own words." Sophie read them late into the night, page after page of Clara's thoughts, hopes, grief, entries about pregnancy cravings and baby kicks, about Sophie's first smile, first laugh, first word, and then, after the fire, pages and pages of anguish. "I should have been there. I should have saved her. What kind of mother am I? Francis says I need to move on, but how do you move on from losing your child? She was my whole world. I went to her room today, sat in the rocking chair and sang the lullaby I used to sing. I swear I could feel her there. My sweet girl, my Sophie." The last entry was dated 2 weeks before Clara's death. "I had the strangest dream last night. Sophie was alive, grown up, beautiful. She came home and everything was right again. I know it was just a dream, but it felt so real. Like maybe, somewhere, she's still out there, still my little girl." Sophie closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. "She knew," she whispered to the empty room. Somehow she knew. Outside, the November moon hung full and bright over Lancaster Estate. Inside, Sophie Lancaster, no longer Ava Collins, no longer lost, finally began to understand what it meant to be home. The courtroom was smaller than Sophie expected. She'd imagined something grand and imposing from TV shows. High ceilings, dramatic lighting, rows of spectators. Instead, it was just a plain room with fluorescent lights, uncomfortable wooden benches, and the stale smell of old coffee and anxiety. Valerie sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back severely, no makeup. She looked 10 years older than she had at dinner that night. Her lawyer, expensive, slick, the kind who defended wealthy criminals, leaned close, whispering something. Valerie nodded without expression. Sophie sat in the front row with Francis. His hand found hers. Squeezed tight, Mason was at home with Mrs. Henshaw. Too young for this, Francis had decided. Some things children shouldn't have to see. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Morrison. Everyone stood. The judge entered. A black woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an expression that said she'd seen everything and believed very little of it. She settled into her chair, surveyed the courtroom, and nodded to the bailiff. "You may be seated. Case number 2024, CR 8847, State of Tennessee versus Valerie Catherine Lancaster. Charges are kidnapping in the first degree, arson, child endangerment, and fraud. How does the defendant plead?" Valerie's lawyer stood. Not guilty by reason of mental defect, Your Honor. Francis's hand tightened on Sophie's. The prosecution, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes named Sandra Reeves, stood immediately. Your Honor, the state objects. The defendant has shown no evidence of mental impairment that would prevent her from understanding her actions. We have psychiatric evaluations, the defense lawyer began. Bought and paid for, Reeves interrupted. The state's psychiatrist found Ms. Lancaster perfectly competent. She knew exactly what she was doing when she kidnapped a 2-year-old child, when she set fire to that nursery, and when she maintained the lie for 21 years. Your Honor, Judge Morrison held up a hand. I'll review the psychiatric reports and make a determination. For now, we'll proceed with the preliminary hearing. Miss Reeves, call your first witness. The state calls Francis Lancaster. Francis stood, squeezed Sophie's hand one more time, and walked to the witness stand. His hand trembled slightly as he placed it on the Bible. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Reeves approached, her expression sympathetic. Mr. Lancaster, can you tell us about the night of March 11th, 2003? Francis's voice was steady, but Sophie could hear the pain underneath. I was in New York on business. My wife Clara called me around 12:30 in the morning. She was hysterical, screaming that there was a fire, that she couldn't get to Sophie, our daughter. By the time I got home the next afternoon, the fire was out, but the nursery was destroyed. They told us, his voice broke. They told us Sophie had died in the fire. Did you have any reason to doubt that? No. The fire chief said the heat had been so intense. He stopped, collected himself. They found bone fragments. We held a funeral. We buried an empty casket because there wasn't enough to... He couldn't finish. And when did you learn your daughter was alive? 6 weeks ago, she applied to be my son's nanny. When I saw her, I thought she looked familiar, but I told myself I was imagining things. Then she saw a photograph of Sophie, recognized herself. We did a DNA test. He looked directly at Valerie for the first time. My sister took my daughter and let me believe she was dead for 21 years. Objection, the defense lawyer said. Assumes facts not in evidence. Sustained, Mr. Lancaster. Please stick to what you know, not what you believe. I know my daughter is alive, Francis said. I know she spent 21 years in foster care. I know she grew up without a family because someone took her from her crib and abandoned her at an orphanage. And I know my wife died blaming herself for something she didn't do. The defense lawyer stood. Your Honor, the witness is being inflammatory. Mr. Lancaster, Judge Morrison said. I understand your emotions, but please answer the questions without editorial. Francis nodded. Jaw tight, the defense lawyer's cross-examination was brutal. He implied that Francis was an absent father, that he'd neglected his family for business, that maybe Valerie had acted out of concern for Sophie's welfare. Francis remained calm through all of it. But Sophie could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. Finally, it was over. Francis returned to his seat, and Reeves called her next witness. The state calls Sophie Elizabeth Lancaster. Sophie stood on shaking legs. Every eye in the courtroom followed her to the stand. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. Reeves smiled encouragingly. Ms. Lancaster, can you tell us about your childhood? Sophie took a breath. I grew up at St. Michael's Children's Center. I was found there on March 12th, 2003, the morning after the fire at Lancaster Estate. No one knew who I was or where I'd come from. They called me Ava Collins because I needed a name for the paperwork. What do you remember from before the orphanage? Almost nothing. Fragments. Mostly a soft blue blanket, someone singing, a feeling of being safe. Sophie's voice caught. And this necklace, I've worn it every day since I can remember. It has S.E.L. engraved on the back. Sophie Elizabeth Lancaster. And you were never told you had a family looking for you? No. I was told I'd been abandoned, that whoever my parents were, they didn't want me. Reeves let that sit for a moment. How has learning the truth affected you? Sophie looked at Valerie for the first time. Their eyes met. Valerie looked away first. I spent 21 years believing I was nobody, Sophie said quietly. That I came from nothing, that I didn't matter to anyone. I worked minimum wage jobs, lived in a studio apartment the size of a closet, and told myself I was lucky to have that much. And the whole time, I had a father who loved me, a mother who grieved for me until it killed her, a family, a home, an inheritance, a name. Tears spilled over. She stole all of that from me, from all of us. The defense lawyer's cross-examination tried to paint Sophie as a gold digger, someone who'd fabricated her identity to claim an inheritance. But the DNA evidence was ironclad, and even he couldn't shake that. Over the next 3 days, more witnesses testified. The fire chief who'd investigated the original blaze, the director of St. Michael's who'd taken Sophie in, DNA experts who explained the test results, character witnesses who spoke about Valerie's jealousy of Clara, her unhealthy dependence on Francis. And then, on the 4th day, Valerie took the stand. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I didn't plan it," she said. "I swear I didn't plan it. I'd been drinking that night and I went to the nursery to see Sophie, to hold her. But she started crying, and I couldn't make her stop, and She stopped, tears streaming down her face. I panicked. I put her in my car and drove to the orphanage. I told myself someone would find her, take care of her, give her a better life than Francis could. He was always working, always traveling. Clara was. Clara was so wrapped up in being a mother, she didn't have time for me anymore. "So you set the fire?" Reeves asked. "I used a candle. Made it look like an accident, I thought." Valerie's voice broke. "I thought Francis would lean on me, that we'd grieve together, that things would go back to how they were before. But they never did." Clara blamed herself. And Francis just pulled away from everyone. And I couldn't tell the truth, because by then, she sobbed. "I destroyed everything." The courtroom was silent. "Ms. Lancaster," Judge Morrison said, "do you understand that your actions resulted in the death of Clara Lancaster? That your brother lost 21 years with his daughter? That Sophie grew up alone because of you?" "Yes." Valerie's whisper was anguished. "Yes, I understand. And yet you never came forward, never told the truth. I was scared and ashamed, and the longer I waited, the harder it got. 21 years is a long time to be scared," the judge said dryly. The verdict came back in less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. At sentencing a week later, Judge Morrison showed no mercy. "Miss Lancaster, you committed one of the most selfish acts I've encountered in 30 years on the bench. You stole a child from her family out of jealousy, then spent 2 decades maintaining that lie while living off your brother's wealth and grief. You are sentenced to 15 years in state prison, with possibility of parole after 10. The gavel came down with finality. Sophie sat in the courtroom afterwards, watching as they led Valerie away in handcuffs. Before she disappeared through the door, Valerie looked back one last time. "I'm sorry," she mouthed. Sophie stood. Francis tried to stop her, but she pulled away gently. She walked up to the barrier separating the gallery from the defendant's area, close enough that Valerie could hear. "I forgive you," Sophie said quietly. Valerie's eyes went wide. "Not because you deserve it," Sophie continued, "but because I'm not going to let what you did poison the rest of my life. You took 21 years. You don't get to take any more." Valerie nodded, tears streaming down her face. Then the guards led her away. Francis appeared beside Sophie, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "That was incredibly generous." "No," Sophie said. "It was self-preservation. Hate is heavy. I don't want to carry it." They walked out of the courthouse together, into the bright December sunshine. The media was waiting, but security kept them back. As they climbed into the car, Sophie looked back at the building one last time. Justice had been served, but more importantly, she was free. Free from the past, from the lies, from the weight of not knowing. Free to be Sophie Lancaster, free to go home. 3 months later, spring came to Nashville. The red maple tree that had stood bare and skeletal through winter began to bud. Tiny leaves unfurling in shades of red and green. Daffodils pushed through the garden soil. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. Sophie stood at her bedroom window. Truly her bedroom now, filled with books she'd chosen, photos she'd framed, pieces of herself scattered throughout. and watched Mason chase butterflies across the lawn. He'd grown taller in the past few months, more confident. He called her Sophie now instead of Ava, though sometimes he still slipped up. She didn't mind. A knock at her door. "Come in." Francis entered, dressed more casually than she'd ever seen him. Jeans, a sweater, no tie. He'd been working less, delegating more to his vice presidents, spending time with his children instead of his spreadsheets. "The caterers just arrived," he said. "Mrs. Henshaw is directing them like a general commanding troops." Sophie smiled. "She's been planning this for weeks. I think she's more excited than I am." "I doubt that's possible." Francis moved to stand beside her at the window. "How are you feeling? Nervous? Excited? Terrified?" Sophie laughed. "All of the above." Today was the official ceremony, the one they'd planned carefully, deliberately, a private event to formally introduce Sophie Lancaster to Nashville society, to the board of the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, to the extended family and friends who'd been kept at arm's length during the trial and its aftermath, and to say goodbye to the life she'd had before. "Second thoughts?" Francis asked gently. "No, not about this." Sophie touched her necklace, the butterfly pendant that had led her home. "But sometimes I think about Ava Collins, about who she was, what she might have become if things had been different." "She became you," Francis said. "Strong, compassionate, resilient. Those qualities didn't come from being Sophie Lancaster. They came from being Ava Collins. From surviving what you survived. You don't have to leave that behind." "I know, but it feels like..." Sophie struggled for words. "Like I'm standing between two lives, the one I had and the one I was supposed to have, and I'm not sure how to be both." Francis was quiet for a moment. "Your mother used to say that we're not just one person. We're the sum of every experience, every choice, every version of ourselves we've ever been. You're Ava and Sophie, the orphan and the heiress, the survivor and the daughter. You don't have to choose." Tears pricked Sophie's eyes. "I wish I could have known her, really known her. She would have loved you so much." Francis's voice was thick. "She would have been so proud of who you've become." Downstairs, the doorbell rang. Voices floated up. Mrs. Henshaw greeting early arrivals. Mason shouting something about the balloons in the garden. "I should get ready," Sophie said. Francis kissed her forehead. "I'll see you downstairs, take your time." After he left, Sophie moved to her closet. The dress hung there, waiting. Pale blue silk. Elegant but not ostentatious. Clara had bought it years ago for a daughter who'd never worn it, never grown into it. Francis had found it in storage, preserved carefully, and asked Sophie if she'd like to wear it today. She'd cried when she first tried it on. It fit perfectly. As she dressed, Sophie thought about the past 3 months. The media frenzy had died down eventually, reduced to occasional tabloid speculation and society page mentions. The foundation board had welcomed her enthusiastically. Impressed by her ideas for expansion and her genuine passion for helping at-risk children, she'd started college classes. Online for now, but she was learning, growing, becoming the person she'd always wanted to be. She'd also been seeing a therapist twice a week. Dr. Brennan was patient, kind, and completely unimpressed by the Lancaster name or fortune. They talked about identity, trauma, forgiveness, about grief for a mother Sophie barely remembered, and a childhood that had been stolen, about anger that came in waves, sometimes directed at Valerie, sometimes at the universe for its cosmic unfairness. "Healing isn't linear," Dr. Brennan had said in their last session. "Some days you'll feel whole. Some days you'll feel like that scared little girl in the orphanage. Both are okay. Both are part of your story." A soft knock. "Sophie," Mason's voice. "Can I come in?" "Of course, buddy." He entered, wearing a miniature suit that made him look impossibly grown up. "Wow, you look like a princess." "You look pretty fancy yourself." Sophie crouched down to adjust his bow tie. "You ready for this?" "Are you?" Smart kid, always asking the right questions. "I think so," Sophie said honestly. "It's going to be weird, having all these people here, meeting them as Sophie instead of Ava. But you're still you," Mason said with 5-year-old wisdom. "It doesn't matter what name people call you. You're still my sister." Sophie pulled him into a hug. "When did you get so smart?" "Dad says I get it from you." "Dad's biased." "What's biased mean?" Sophie laughed. "I'll explain later. Come on, let's go downstairs." The garden had been transformed. White tents, strings of lights even though it was still afternoon, tables laden with food and flowers. About 50 people milled around. Family friends, business associates, foundation board members, all people Francis trusted, all people who'd agreed to keep the event private, away from press and gossip columns. Sophie descended the back stairs with Mason's hand in hers. As they stepped into the garden, conversations quieted. Everyone turned. Francis stood near the red maple tree, waiting. He smiled when he saw her, eyes bright with emotion. Sophie took a breath and walked forward. Mason stayed close, her small protector. "Thank you all for coming," Francis began when she reached him. "3 months ago, my world changed. My daughter, who I'd believed dead for 21 years, came home. It's been," his voice caught, "it's been the greatest gift of my life." He turned to Sophie. "I lost you once. Lost years we can never get back. But I've learned that family isn't just about time. It's about love, commitment, choosing each other every day. And I choose you, Sophie. I will always choose you." Sophie couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She just nodded. Francis raised his glass. "To Sophie Elizabeth Lancaster, my daughter home at last." "To Sophie," everyone echoed. The afternoon passed in a blur of introductions and conversations. Board members discussed foundation initiatives with genuine interest in her input. Family friends shared memories of Clara, painting a picture of the mother Sophie had lost. A few people were awkward, unsure how to address the situation, but most were kind. And through it all, Sophie felt something settling inside her. Not the erasure of Ava Collins, but the integration of 2 lives into one whole person. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the garden, Sophie found herself beneath the red maple tree, the same tree from the photograph, the same tree that had witnessed so much history. Francis appeared beside her, holding something wrapped in soft blue fabric. "I've been saving this," he said quietly, "for the right moment." He unwrapped it carefully. The blue blanket, the one from her fragments of memory, the one Clara had wrapped her in as a baby. It had been preserved all these years, kept in storage with other remnants of Sophie's short childhood. Sophie took it with trembling hands. The fabric was soft, worn. She lifted it to her face and breathed in. It smelled like cedar and thyme, but underneath was something familiar, something that whispered of safety and love. "Thank you," she whispered. "There's something else." Francis pulled out his phone, scrolled for a moment, then handed it to her. "I found this last week, a video Clara took when you were about 18 months old." Sophie pressed play. The image was grainy, but clear enough. A little girl with dark curls toddled across a living room, laughing. Behind her, Clara's voice. "Come to Mama, sweet girl, come on, Sophie." The child turned, beamed at the camera, and ran forward. The video ended with Clara laughing, the image shaking as she presumably caught her daughter in a hug. Sophie watched it 3 times before she could look away. "She loved you," Francis said. "Every single day, she loved you, and she never stopped hoping." "I know," Sophie said. "I read her journals. I felt it." They stood together in the fading light, father and daughter, beneath the tree that had seen everything. The tree that had been in the photograph, that had watched Sophie's first steps, that had weathered storms and seasons, and stood strong through it all. "I'm home," Sophie said softly. "I'm really home." "Yes," Francis said. "You are." Mason ran up, breathless. "Sophie, come see. The butterflies are everywhere." She let him pull her away from the tree, across the lawn to where dozens of butterflies danced in the sunset light. Mason tried to catch them gently, laughing each time they escaped. Sophie looked back at Francis, who watched them with an expression of pure joy. She looked at the house, her home. She looked at the garden full of people who cared about her, who'd welcomed her, and she looked at the blue blanket in her hands. The physical proof that she'd been loved from the very beginning. Ava Collins had been strong, had survived, had fought for every scrap of dignity and hope. Sophie Lancaster would honor that strength, would use the resources and opportunities she'd been given to help others. She was both. She was whole. and standing there in the garden, with the butterflies swirling around her, and her brother laughing at her side, and her father watching with love in his eyes, Sophie finally understood what it meant to be home. Not a place, not a name, but the people who loved you, who chose you, who would never let you go. She was home, and she always would be.